Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, emerging market assets strengthened today on the back of some optimism over the prospects for a Phase 1 Sino-US trade deal. However, a raft of mixed signals earlier in the week did keep those gains constrained. We saw MSCI's index of developing world stocks rising about 0.4% on the day, having touched a more than 1 month low on Wednesday. Meanwhile, Africa's key markets mostly closing in the red today. South Africa's JSE was lower as traders pondered the latest headlines regarding the US-China trade war. We saw banks and resources were the biggest losers today. Now, also coming up on the show, restructuring specialists take over in a last-ditch attempt to save South African Airways. Nationwide pension strikes threaten to paralyze France. And the world's next superfood could very well come from Ethiopia. Well, let's start off with the latest on South African Airways. The situation at the airline remains quite tense, and that's following the late payments of November's salaries. Now, the presidency has also decided to change its approach and seek the business rescue option in order to save the airline from collapse. Here's Angelo Coppola with the latest.
NUMSA and the SA Cabin Crew Association have been blamed for current reputational damage and loss of business at the national flag carrier. And then early on Thursday morning, Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan announced the business rescue option. It's something the Solidarity Union has been calling for, and NUMSA was also interested in that approach. NUMSA says a strike isn't an option at this stage, saying they want to save the airline.
Solidarity is not pushing for retrenchments at SAA. They are pushing for voluntary severance packages. Now, that's in line with what we want too. They're pushing for the implementation of a turnaround strategy. That's what we want too. There are other areas where we differ, for example, on the area of SAAT, where they are promoting that SAAT should be sold. We don't really support that. But the bottom line is, overall, there does seem to be some alignment.
There have been several strategies and plans unveiled and sometimes acted on, but none have been successful or been given enough time to make a difference. Business rescue is the final option.
Whoever is appointed as the rescue practitioner must have the appropriate, expertise about the airline, about what needs to be done, and must not be interfered with in doing it. And the business rescue environment is such that it is a highly controlled environment. It has specific outputs over specific time frames, and therefore there's certainty there. That's why now you have the lenders coming in and say, look, we can extend our monies now.
It's going to be bad for SAA, but it's good for the country, it's good for the taxpayer. It is also showing that government is very serious about changing the nature of the bailouts.
The future airline will look very different to today. The domestic market will be serviced by its low-cost operator, Mango.
Then there's an international market, which is where SAA should be. Not as it is now, but as it should be after this process.
It's make or break right now for South African Airways and for the government in terms of what they're going to do with the state-owned entity and whether it's going to continue in its present form or not. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now, of course, Solidarity Union did launch this business rescue effort in a court. Well, let's examine this move further with Solidarity's Deputy CEO and Head of Legal, Werner Human. He joins us now in Johannesburg. Very great to have you on the show with us, sir. Now, given the airline's already precarious financial state and, of course, the total loss of confidence it is facing from stakeholders as well as customers, how much faith do you really have in this business rescue plan salvaging South African Airlines?
Good evening and thank you for having us on. The fact remains for SAA that's the only option left. If business rescue proceedings are not initiated, it would mean that SAA will shut down, it will mean that it will be liquidated, it will mean that about 40 to 50 billion rands would become payable. It would mean 11,000 people would be without a job. This is the best option available for SAA. It is long overdue, and finally this moment has come. We might also just add, this is not a voluntary resolution. It has come on the backdrop of the application that Solidarity has lodged, and finally SAA is here.
Well, Public Minister Pravin Gordhan, he did say that the carrier will receive about $272 million in funding from lenders, which is going to be guaranteed by the government. Now, the reality is South Africa's government right now is financially stretched. So what are the biggest risks you see to the success of this business rescue process going forward?
First of all, these capital injections are necessary because they are there to keep the airline afloat. Without that cash, it simply cannot operate. So they are in desperate need of that cash. At this stage, there are many risks, but the largest risk would be if there is no cooperation from SAA side, from government sides and other stakeholders with the business rescue practitioner. You need to assist the business rescue practitioner, give him or her the most available information there in order to secure a plan to get the airline out of this distraught position. Solidarity has taken issue thus far with the fact that we've not been consulted pertaining to the practitioner itself, but that is something we will take further with the airline. In short, everybody needs to work together, everybody needs to be on the same page, and we must be able to accept hard decisions that will be made in relation to SAA.
Well, with regards to that, the reality is the process may involve further job cuts, which, of course, the airline needs to return to profit. How will the unions in South Africa respond to this particular scenario?
Unfortunately, restructuring and job losses is part of this process. We must emphasize it's not the fault of the employees or the workers. This is a product of more than a decade of maladministration, of corruption, of plundering, and at the end of the day, it's the workers and the employees that bear the full brunt of this inadequacy on the side of SAA. So this is an unfortunate consequence, and that's why, although not ideal, if we don't follow this business rescue procedure, it would mean everything would be lost. So we must salvage what we can, but at the end of the day, it won't be without some loss.
Right. I'm curious to know whether you agree with Finance Minister Tito Mboweni that it may be better if South African Airlines was shut down. What's your take on that?
We do not agree with that point of view. It must be considered that he must know that if we shut down SAA now, we've got 40 or 50 billion rands that would be immediately payable. A couple of months ago, President Ramaphosas said in Parliament, the finances of the country are depleted. The finances are depleted. Those are very strong words. It is a very strong statement, and it means that a shutdown of SAA will not only revolve around the isolation of SAA, it will have repercussions for our economy, for our taxpayers as a whole. All of those things would have if there's announcements like this. The question is there anything salvageable of SAA? And the answer is there is. SAA as a whole has trouble. SAA as a whole has many challenges, but there are parts within SAA that is salvageable. There are profitable routes. There may be profitable routes. You've got the brand SAA. There are a few other ways that there's advantage for this to take off. So to order a shutdown is simply not viable, and we don't think that's a correct way to go.
All right, we'll certainly be watching, but quickly, where does Solidarity and its members, on that note, stand on President Ramaphosa's economic revival strategy? Do you think it's been successful?
No, it has not. A couple of days ago, it was released that South Africa experienced a negative 0.6% growth, economic growth. It's unfathomable that in our low economic growth environment, government is still announcing on projects of nationalization. They're effectively with the NHI bill, which is a national health insurance, announcing that they endeavour to nationalise healthcare. That is our view. And they also continue with expropriation without compensation, which is something which must be met with the most strongest opposition. They are still continuing with those policies, regardless of our economic growth, which is in the negative. So we find that although the document that Minister Tito Mboweni had produced a couple of months ago is pragmatic and has some positive steps, we find it disappointing that they still go forth with a program of nationalisation of health and nationalisation of property. That's the nature of the policies. They would, of course, differ with our description of it, but they still go on with these projects, and that's a huge reason for concern at the moment.
Right. Well, we do have to leave it there, but many thanks for your insights, Mr. Human. Of course, that's Solidarity's Deputy CEO and Head of Legal, Werner Human, joining us there in Johannesburg. Well, staying in South Africa, German automaker Volkswagen has landed itself in hot water over a radio commercial which aired in South Africa. Now, the ad likens women to animals during a shoe shopping frenzy. It has since been withdrawn and banned by the advertising authority. Here's CGTN's Julie Shire with more on that story.
VW is a popular brand in South Africa with the fastest selling passenger car on the market. It's been criticized for an ad comparing women to animals during a shoe sale. Dr. Sue Goldstein from Wits University Public Health School levied complaint against the car maker on boxing women into a dangerous generalization.
It was so sexually stereotyping, really creating the feeling that women are frivolous, money-grabbing, fighting each other over shoes. And it's just so far from the South African reality, where women are the backbone of society and the strength of families. So I was really angry around how this ad depicted women.
VW brushed it off as parody, but South Africa's advertising regulatory body took the complaint seriously and has since ordered the automaker to withdraw the ad.
I was really glad that they actually agreed with my perception, and they used the British standard, which I found very interesting. Because I don't think South Africa has a gender standard for advertising. So I was really excited about it.
South African women also weighed in on the debate.
Almost gives men the permission to treat women as second-rate citizens, treat them differently to the way they would treat their fellow men. And I think it is very dangerous. I think it does perpetuate the whole notion that women are not equal to men, and that they shouldn't be taken seriously.
When we're trying to fight back this gender-based violence and patriarchy in the system, in our government, and how things are done, stereotyping like this in the media, it's not helpful at all. It's just reversing the process that we're trying to fix things in our country.
I do feel like it was a really sexist angle that they took. And of course, with everything that's going on in South Africa, with the gender-based violence, it really did make me now reconsider purchasing a VW in the future.
Women are already subject to inequality and high rates of violence. The advertising authorities stress that the use of gender stereotypes in the ad contributes further to this divide in a country that is fraught with toxic masculinity.
Women have called for responsible messaging and more stringent regulation around advertising. Julie Shire, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now look at our corporate headlines today. Botswana coal miner Minergy has put on hold plans to list on London's junior AIM stock market. Minergy joins more than a dozen companies that have shelved their stock market listing plans in Europe this year due to global trade tensions, as well as fears about Britain's protracted exit from the European Union. And Saudi Aramco's bookrunners have recommended the oil giant go with $8.5 per share in its initial public offering. At that level, Aramco will have a market valuation of about $1.7 trillion, comfortably overtaking Apple as the world's most valuable listed firm. However, it will miss the $2 trillion target initially sought by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And in South Africa, the country's second biggest insurer, Old Mutual, is back in court to overturn a ruling that temporarily reinstated its former CEO. Now, Peter Moyo was fired by the insurer in June over an alleged conflict of interest. However, in July, a high court in Johannesburg reinstated Moyo as Old Mutual CEO, saying his dismissal was illegal. And finally, Chinese telecoms giant Huawei has filed a fresh legal challenge against a decision by U.S. regulators that classify it as a national security threat. The move comes after the U.S. Federal Communications Commission put curbs on rural U.S. wireless carriers from using an $8.5 billion government fund to buy Huawei's equipment. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. Well, let's head into a quick break now. Still to come on the show. Nigeria hosts an Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement forum in Lagos. And Uganda plans to borrow almost $700 million from international banks.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN. Welcome back. Well, let's go to Nigeria now. The country has hosted an African Continental Free Trade Agreement forum in Lagos. The theme of this year's event is effective implementation of the AfCFTA for industrialization and inclusive economic development. Now, it brought together the private sector in Nigeria with an objective to learn how to best leverage the opportunities within the trade agreement. This forum is part of a comprehensive project which aims to deepen Africa's trade integration through effective implementation of the deal. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has been working with its partners to ensure effective implementation strategies.
We have probably one of the biggest manufacturing capacities in the continent. There may be 2 or 3 other countries that perhaps can compete with us in that regard. But what has made our manufacturing less competitive has been the environment in which they operate and the current policies and regulations that circumscribe our operations. And I think the fact is now emerging that first of all, the environment has to change. A lot of new policies have to be introduced that will make trading and manufacturing more cost-effective, more competitive. And of course, we must build the infrastructure that is absolutely vital for cost-effective operation.
Well, let's get the latest on the discussions on ground from Ayola Olukani. He's the Director General at the Nigerian Association of Chambers of Commerce, Industry, Mines and Agriculture. Great to have you on the show with us, sir. Now, of course, as we mentioned, this forum will educate the private sector specifically on how to best leverage those opportunities within the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So give us a sense of the highlights of the discussion today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. The discussion today, like you said, is a national forum on the effective implementation and also getting, especially the Nigerian private sector, ready to play effectively when the African Continental Free Trade Area starts in July. So we all gathered in here to be part of this dialogue deepening the engagement, and also letting the Nigerian private sector, preparing them for effective implementation. I think we've had a very good day in terms of the various discussion. It's a 2-day affair. And the Nigerian Association of Chambers of Commerce and Industry is very, very happy and keen and working with others, including Manufacturer Association, to bring on the Nigerian private sector on this Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Right. Now, one of the ironies that this forum is being held in Nigeria is the fact that Nigeria was one of the nations that took quite a while to ink that agreement. I think it inked it in July this year. And that, of course, was on the back of concerns from its private sector about the impact, of course, of this AFCFTA on their industry. So how are these concerns being addressed at the forum? Are they valid? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it was indeed a very good thing that Nigeria that delayed a little bit, and the private sector had to take on and ask some questions that, hey, government, before you sign, there are things we need to ask, which led to the consultative process, which took some time. I'm not sure if there are many African countries who did that. People just went ahead to sign. But in Nigeria, we had a consultative process, which took some time across the nation. And then the private sector were closely involved in that process. I think it was very good because it was able to, in the private sector, draw attention to certain area, and also the people who were negotiating also saw a few areas which Nigeria pointed out. And at the end of the day, after that consultative process, everybody now came on board and said, okay, fine. And I think that was why when government went on and the president went on to Niamey to sign, very many of the contentious areas were already settled out in the private sector. That's not the end of it. Implementation is different. And this is why, of course, we are continuing this dialogue series. And if we continue to look at areas of trade and services, the question of investment, the whole issues of services, the whole issues of mediation, these are an entire area which this national forum is looking at. And of course, at the end of the day, I think an outcome document will come to continue guide the processes in terms of the question of effective implementation, especially by the Nigerian private sector. Because don't forget, AFCTA is for the African private sector, not government.
Right. Can you give us a sense of some of those tangible outcomes that we can expect, of course, when the forum comes to an end tomorrow?
Well, one of the main things is that already we have a National Action Committee. We expect some of the outcome that will come from this conference will include the outline of the strategies which the National Action Committee in Nigeria will also follow in terms of the question of implementation. Then there will also be an assessment of the areas of strength as far as Nigeria is concerned itself. The outcome document, one of the outcomes we expect is to identify the broad areas in terms of strengths as far as Nigeria itself is concerned in implementation, and also specific areas and issues such as the role of women in this particular area, the SMEs, what will be the strategy to make sure they also effectively participate. And finally, and also most importantly, the question of infrastructure, because that is key to enable Nigeria play effectively on the canvas. And I think that's why we're very happy in terms of what we're collaboration with China, which is working closely with Nigeria to improve infrastructure in the area of rail, in the area of road, in the area of energy, for us to reposition the Nigerian private sector to be able to play effectively when the implementation starts in July.
Well, we'll certainly be keenly watching for the outcomes of that forum. Many thanks for joining us in the studio. Of course, that was Mr. Ayola Olukani. He is the Director General of the Nigerian Association of Chambers of Commerce, Industry, Mines and Agriculture. Well, let's move on now. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has met with his Ghanaian counterpart, Nana Akufo-Addo, in Accra. The two leaders held bilateral talks and witnessed the signing of various agreements. President Ramaphosa pledged his country's continued cooperation with Ghana for the benefit of both sides. Now, before heading to Ghana, Ramaphosa was in Guinea, and CGTN's Yolisa Njamela has more on that trip.
In 2018, South Africa and Equatorial Guinea marked 25 years since the formalization of diplomatic relations. Bilateral cooperation has spanned health, trade, manufacturing, infrastructure, industrial, as well as education and training. This working visit provides an opportunity for South Africa to explore new areas of cooperation with Guinea, to also promote increased trade and investment flows to the mutual benefit of the peoples of the two countries.
We have also agreed to expand relations further between our two countries, especially economic cooperation, so that our peoples can benefit from the relations between the two countries.
Ramaphosa wants the two countries to especially increase business trade.
At the commercial level, we noted with satisfaction that there are some 8 South African companies that are conducting business here and have invested here. We obviously would like to see more South African companies investing in Guinea, as well as to have an exchange of investments from Guinea to South Africa as well.
President Ramaphosa is also using the trip to engage his counterparts on the state of the continent's quest for peace and prosperity. This is in line with the aspirations of the African Union's transformative Agenda 2063, as well as reform of the global governance system. The visit comes ahead of South Africa's assumption of the African Union chairmanship in 2020. South Africa will be taking over from Egypt. Yolisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's head to Uganda now. The country is set to line up loan requests of an estimated $661 million from international banks. Now, the funding is needed to plug a hole in the 2019 and 2020 budget after domestic revenue collections fell short by 9%. Concerns have been raised about the country's accumulating debt that is pegged at $11.8 billion currently. The International Monetary Fund has warned that the debt will surpass 50% of GDP in the 2021 and 2022 financial year. Now, Uganda's government has announced plans to borrow the money from a local unit of South Africa's Standard Bank and the Regional Trade Development Bank. Of course, you're watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a short break now. Still to come. Nationwide pension strikes threaten to paralyze France. And OPEC searches for ways to manage its oil production for the year 2020.
Holding guns. Machine guns from police forces towards the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time? Not at all.
Thank you very much for your time. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Penina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed. And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
I'm Uche Okoronkwo reporting from Nairobi's city center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN, see the difference. How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in. Business in Africa is high risk. After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN. Half past the hour, let's recap today's top headlines. At least 58 migrants have drowned off the coast of Mauritania. The incident is one of the deadliest to happen this year. The boat was coming from the Gambia and was headed to Spain's Canary Islands. Now, fewer ships had been using the passage since Spanish authorities stepped up patrols. The UN's migration agency says about 83 survivors swam to shore. The International Organization for Migration is providing them with further assistance. Meanwhile, the United States and Sudan plan to begin exchanging ambassadors after a 23-year gap. The announcement came during Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok's first visit to Washington this week. The relationship between the two countries has improved since the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir in April. However, Sudan remains on a list of countries which are deemed sponsors of terrorism. And finally, Cyclone Pawan is set to hit Somalia on Saturday. The storm is expected to make landfall as a weak tropical cyclone. Now, this will make it the 8th cyclone formed over the North Indian Ocean this year. The last time 8 cyclones were formed in the Arabian Sea was in 1976 and 1987. And that's a recap of today's top headlines. And on the international front, a protest against changes to France's pension system has brought parts of the country to a grinding halt. On Thursday, unions embarked on a nationwide strike, which was aimed at forcing President Emmanuel Macron to abandon plans to overhaul the country's pension system. Now, Macron says he wants to simplify France's pension system, which comprises of more than 40 different plans with different retirement ages and benefits. As a result, he now wants a single point-based system under which for each euro contributed, every pensioner has equal rights. However, workers still argue that the proposed reforms will make them work longer for smaller pensions. Meanwhile, OPEC is looking at ways to manage its oil production for the coming year in a meeting at its headquarters in Vienna. The organization has been considering ways to stabilize the market amid falling oil prices due to decreased demand. As 2020 approaches, OPEC also faces a number of other challenges. With more details, here's CGTN's Natalie Carney reporting from Vienna.
When oil-producing countries first established OPEC nearly 6 decades ago, they were essentially the only players in town. But a lot has changed since 1960. Today, the production of crude oil by the companies themselves and the discovery of shell oil has reduced OPEC's share of the world's oil supply from 70% to roughly 25%.
What has changed the nature and the business altogether in the last 10 years was the emergence of shale oil, because shale oil is a kind of production that is more short-term in terms of investment cycle. You can very quickly switch on and switch off the production. And that was a challenge for OPEC.
The U.S., a non-OPEC member, has increased its production of shell oil to an average of 12.4 million barrels a day, reducing the dependency on imports while also adding to the export market. The U.S.-China trade dispute is also a threat to oil prices in general.
The dispute between U.S. and China has a big impact on the global growth. Yeah? The oil demand growth is slowing down because the global trade is slowing down. And all that is a problem because obviously when oil demand is not growing, but on the other side supply is growing, yeah? That's not good for prices.
In July, OPEC members extended their production cuts of 1.2 million barrels per day for a further 9 months in an effort to ward off tumbling prices. And it is expected that the organization will further extend those cuts, retaining production targets through 2020 at this week's meeting.
While these cuts attempt to balance and stabilize the market, some smaller OPEC members are affected more adversely. Qatar left the organization at the beginning of 2019, and Ecuador is expected to do the same in January to pursue their own oil policies. Yet despite the challenges, many believe OPEC remains a relevant organization.
I believe strongly that OPEC is a cooperation of sovereign countries, and these countries have agreed to work together. And I think that is the basis, that's the success OPEC has recorded over the years. And I wouldn't agree that OPEC is dying. If there are 24 countries committed to working together, and if those countries are still committed to that cooperation, I don't see where death is coming in that area.
Look, OPEC is relevant, and OPEC has a good job that they're doing.
OPEC members could implement further oil production cuts in the near future. Yet as long as prices remain moderate and stable, investment into more costly shell oil will decrease, a trend that would likely play out favorably for OPEC.
Let's turn our attention now to climate matters. A recent report shows that global carbon dioxide emissions were slowing down, and that's thanks to a sharp drop in coal use in the United States and in Europe, as well as softening coal demand in China and India. Now, the report by the Global Carbon Project Research Group showed that carbon dioxide emissions are estimated to increase only 0.6% this year, compared with a 2.1% growth last year. Now, overall weaker economic growth also helped to curb the emissions. Still, the report noted a growing appetite for oil and gas. Meanwhile, emissions are accelerating from forest fires and other land use changes. That's why the report said the world is still far from being able to avert global warming. Now, analysts are calling for more policy changes to reduce overall emissions.
Still, emissions are going up. There's a few factors behind that, some related to a weaker economy, some related to some weather events, and some to climate policy. We have strong growth in oil use and strong growth in natural gas. And it's actually natural gas which is really driving emissions up in the last decade. I'd expect carbon dioxide emissions to slowly rise in the next few years. Hopefully with a few more policies in place we can see a peak in emissions within the next decade. But the real question is how to get emissions to go down. So peaking emissions is essentially the easy part. To get emissions down 1%, 2% or 7%, which is what we need per year, then we need some real lift in climate policy.
And now for a look at Uber. The ride-sharing application shares have dropped about 60% since the company came to market in May. But Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi says investments in the company will pay off within a few years. John Terrett has more from New York.
The avenues and cross streets of New York City are especially jammed in December, but things have gotten noticeably worse since ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft started operating here. There are around 13,000 to 14,000 famous yellow cabs in the city, but around 80,000 ride-sharing drivers operating on the same streets these days. Into this congestion comes Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi to address the Empire State Building-based Economic Club of New York, which is not far from Wall Street, which is wary of his company because it's had some staggering losses and high overheads as it trims prices to see off competition. Now, Khosrowshahi says he can make Uber profitable in a couple of years if he really wanted to. Wall Street is skeptical, and one of the reasons for that, as he said here today in New York, he's determined to keep up spending to reach the company's goal, which is transportation of every kind, from ride-sharing to food delivery to trucking and even air transportation, all available on the app.
We will do so in ways that are not profitable for us. We will be tireless in going and building out this movement opportunity and making sure that it's available to everybody, including people who are lucky like us and get to live in city centers, and people who are less fortunate and don't live in city centers and especially live in transportation deserts as well.
Dara says he never applied for the job at Uber. It was offered to him, and he's very glad he took it, even though he was skeptical at first. But making Uber profitable is just one of the huge challenges on his plate. In London, the company has been banned again amid passenger safety worries and concerns that the app allows some of the 45,000 drivers who work for Uber in London to fake their IDs. Khosrowshahi was quick to stress that he thinks the job on safety is far from done. There's a long way to go, he said, but it's a top priority.
We have to make sure that the driver and the rider both are safe, acting in the best manner, etc. And then what we're doing is we're investing very aggressively in features to make sure that your ride is safe, period, and getting safer as time goes on. We have technology now called ride check technology, where if there's a stop, a really, really long stop, or if you go to a place where you're not supposed to go, we will proactively call you.
Right now, the brake lights are on Uber's shares. They're down around 60% since the company first came to market back in May. So addressing the Economic Club of New York City is a way of reintroducing the company to the movers and shakers of Wall Street, to the economists, the bankers, the journalists, and yes, the investors who right now are wondering whether they'll ever see a return on their investment. John Terrett, CGTN, New York.
And moving on now, just 4 months after Cathay Pacific CEO resigned, another airline is facing problems in the wake of Hong Kong's social unrest. Now, the city's third largest carrier, Kong Airlines, is now facing the possible loss of its license due to a financial crisis. Here's Zhao Yunfei with more.
Hong Kong Airlines, for years synonymous with affordable, convenient air travel in and out of the city, now may suspend operations after struggling to pay staff since last month. The Air Transport Licensing Authority says the company's deteriorated financial position means it no longer meets minimum permit standards.
If the company cannot pay the salary of the staff members would be upset, all right? Staff members could make mistakes in the air. Very troublesome, worrying situation.
Therefore, 2 new conditions were attached to Hong Kong Airlines' license on Monday. Number 1, to find new investors that will help provide funding, and number 2, to maintain certain cash levels. A deadline is set for Saturday. Hong Kong Airlines is acting fast. Its chairman responded to CGTN's email interview request, saying an initial cash injection plan has been drawn up. An outstanding salary to staff is due to be paid by Thursday. But travelers are still concerned they may have to change itineraries. Are you worried?
A bit, because I'm afraid that there will have no airplane back to Hong Kong.
I feel it's pretty safe because I believe the crew are professionals and they will take care of us even though they may not have their pay.
Been flying them for quite a long time, so I kind of trust the CAD to make sure the aircraft is still safe, which I believe they've been doing, random checks.
6 months of unrest in Hong Kong have damaged not just this airline, but the whole aviation industry. The situation became fierce when protesters paralyzed the airport in August. Airport figures have continued shrinking in recent months. October's total passengers dropped 13% compared to the same period last year, and the cargo volume handled in the same year saw a decrease of 5.5% year-on-year.
The entire environment is rather unsatisfactory for the overall performance of the aviation sector. What happened so far relating to the negative impact on the industry is mainly political, and only the government can take the correct steps in order to normalize the situation.
Despite the potential financial and safety risks, passengers can still book reservations with Hong Kong Airlines. Airport Authority says they will carry out measures when necessary to ensure normal operations. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Hong Kong.
Meanwhile, the new Apple Card is drawing rave reviews for its simplicity of use and ease in signing up, but it's also drawing fire for how it's setting credit limits, with some people now accusing it of gender bias against women. CGTN's Mark New has the details.
At a March event, Apple CEO Tim Cook unveiled the Apple Card.
Apple Card was created by Apple and built on principles that we stand for, like simplicity and transparency.
That pledge has come under fire when tech entrepreneur David Heinemeier Hansen tweeted that he was approved for an Apple Card with 20 times the credit that his wife received, despite her having a higher credit score. Social media lit up with Apple Card users sharing similar stories, including Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak, who said his Apple Card limit is 10 times that of his wife's, despite the couple not having any separate assets or accounts.
Sounds awful familiar, doesn't it? I mean, it's only been, 40 years that women could get a home loan on their own?
Apple Card user Lloyd LaQuesta says he's especially glad Wozniak has called the company out.
There are no human beings who are making the decisions now. It's just some kind of equation that someone's put in there, and no one challenges it.
And it's an incredibly complex formula. I do think that this may be a very good step for the industry to rethink some of the way they look at this and try to maybe make it more equitable across male and female. But that's not going to happen overnight.
In a statement, the Apple Card's issuing bank Goldman Sachs said the lower credit lines in many cases are because their existing credit cards are supplemental credit cards under their spouse's primary account. It also said if you believe your credit line does not adequately reflect your credit history, we want to hear from you.
They kind of played both sides of this a little bit, that, on one hand, they vehemently denied it. And then on the other, they did say, well, if anybody thinks they've been wronged by this, we will take a second look at your account. The irony here is that Apple Card is actually accepting a lot more people than most rewards credit cards. And in fact, this is part of the Apple DNA. Going back to the 90s, Steve Jobs was thinking way back then about launching a card with Capital One. And they ended up scrapping it in part because Jobs didn't want to deny anybody.
The New York State Department of Financial Services is currently investigating whether the algorithm used by Apple Card to make the credit limit decisions violates laws prohibiting gender discrimination. The department's superintendent even wrote that for innovation to deliver lasting and sustained value, the consumers who use new products or services must be able to trust that they're being treated fairly. Mark New, CGTN, Mountain View, California.
Well, let's move on now and take a look at how commodities performed today. Oil prices edging lower today as, of course, OPEC members are meeting. They are expected to weigh deeper output cuts in an effort to prop up prices and, of course, prevent a glut in 2020. Meanwhile, gold prices edging up today as conflicting signals from Washington and Beijing did prolong the uncertainty about a trade deal. Now, gold prices rose to a one-month high of $1,484 per ounce on Wednesday, but they have settled lower than this after, of course, Trump said that trade talks with China were going very well. Well, let's head into a quick break now. Coming up. We'll tell you why the world's next superfood could very well come from Ethiopia. And we'll give you some tips on how you can safely shop online this festive season.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Canada, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Now, a plant called Encephas has been dubbed the tree against hunger in Ethiopia. It is a staple in the country's highlands where its pulp is used to make bread and porridge. Now, the close relative of the banana is said to be highly drought resilient and nutritious, which is why botanists and chefs now predict that there will be heightened international demand for Enset's superfood properties. Here's CGTN's Alexandria Majala bringing us that story.
Between 1984 and 1985, Ethiopia suffered a devastating drought that gripped the world's attention. An estimated 1 million people lost their lives and many more had to think outside the box to survive. Southwestern Ethiopia's Sombo people trekked eastward to Oliso, where they discovered a vegetable taller than a house. They learned to cultivate Enset, returned home to Sombo, where the alien food grew to be a part of their everyday diet. Today, Martha Daniel is harvesting Enset at her farm in Sidama Zone, south of Ethiopia.
I will take a pulp and bury it in a pit. Then I'll mix it and knead it with my hands. Then I will put it together and seal it with leaves. Then, after a while, it will turn into a pulp. It is taken from there and made ready for food in different forms. It could be baked like a flatbread or molded into a potato-shaped roll of food. You can take along this food in a container when going on a journey.
The plant, which grows up to 10 meters, is a staple for 20 million people in the Ethiopian highlands. Its versatility is arguably unrivaled, as it can be used as a vegetable or turned into flour for bread and porridge. Some of its parts can be used as potato, while its pith can also make cheese. The close relative of the banana is also used for construction materials, packaging, cattle feed, and medicine. Different ethnic groups use Enset in different ways, but the main ones using it for food are the Gurage, Sidama, Gamo, Hadia, and Walaita.
This is called bite. From this you can make food like sakishame, omolocho, and chafeta. Or you can add a bit of water and make flatbread. Also, you can wrap this with leaves, put it in a fire, take it out, and eat it.
Enset's orange fruit is full of bullet-like inedible seeds. Described as a banana on steroids, scientists say it could be a lifesaver for a warming world, as the plant is said to be very drought-tolerant. It has been dubbed the tree against hunger and was among a shopping list of unusual ingredients spotlighted by leading London chefs at a recent event organized by Food Forever. In Hawassa, a town in the Sidama region, kocho dishes, a flatbread made from Enset, feature on the menu in some restaurants.
To make a basam, I first rub the kofam on the wood table called badiru and add some salt and rub it well again. Then I will add a good amount of butter to it. Depending on the amount of butter and the side dishes, you can present it as a basam or as our house special. Then it will be taken to the main kitchen and side dishes like spinach and meat are added to it and served to the customers.
This food is good for your stomach. You can eat as much as you want and it will not upset your stomach. It has been 28 years since I started serving it in this town of Hawassa. I have been serving this food throughout and I even send it abroad. People write to me telling me to send it to them. I send kocho every day.
Although Enset grows wild from Ethiopia down to South Africa, it has only been domesticated in the Ethiopian highlands, which has mystified researchers. Scientists who are now DNA sequencing hundreds of varieties hope Enset could boost food security in other countries such as Zambia and Malawi. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
Now, thousands of customers are pouring into South African malls looking for the best deals and last-minute specials ahead of Christmas. But there's been a significant rise in online shopping too. Unfortunately, hackers are also looking for a quick buck. Sumitra Naidu takes a look at how shoppers can safeguard themselves during this time.
Black Friday and Cyber Monday has become a shopping phenomenon in South Africa. The country is now listed in the top 5 for sales. But with customers crowding the malls, opportunities for theft are rising. So are online scams.
There's a lack of awareness, both from the customer side, from the e-commerce service providers side sometimes, and sometimes from the business owner themselves. We have had a lot of breaches to date. South Africa, though, has a very strong cybersecurity community. And we do have excellent cybersecurity firms which are both service the local community and the global community.
Over 18 million people are using e-commerce platforms in South Africa. This figure is expected to rise to 24 million by 2021. Online retailers grew their share of the technical consumer goods market by 52% last year, accounting for more than 6% of total consumer spending. Experts are warning, though, that consumers need to be more vigilant.
There's quite a lot of excitement, a lot of social activity during this particular period, which creates opportunity for criminals also. And that's why we tend to believe that there's a slight increase in various crime types during this particular period.
The average South African spends a minimum of $146 per month online. Credit and debit cards and PayPal are the most popular methods of payment, making phishing an extreme sport. Phishing is when hackers attempt to get your personal banking information.
So make sure when you're purchasing from a reputable platform, from a reputable brand. Dead giveaways are, the lack of encryption, so HTTPS. You'll always know it on your browser. It's the padlock that goes green. Any reasonable e-commerce site is going to have a valid certificate. If you don't know what an SSL certificate is, what padlock I'm talking about, maybe go and arm yourself through education. Don't share passwords across these multiple platforms.
It's not always happy shopping. Consumers will have to keep their wits about them and stay cyber safe if they don't want to lose all of their money. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, before we go, let's take a quick look at how Africa's currencies performed today. Now, we saw South Africa's rand pretty firm today after slight optimism about a US-China trade deal, which of course lifted market sentiment. Meanwhile, Kenya's shilling strengthening today, underpinned by tightening liquidity in the local money markets, as well as inflows from remittances by Kenyans who work abroad. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.